Welcome to another episode of the Empowered Half Hour. And I am so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Claudia Garbutt. She's like my foreign friend. I don't know. We met in the influencer world. I was on her podcast, and twice she helped cover the book. And we just clicked because we really have such a heart center for high achievers, well being, hitting success without the sacrifice of it all. And so we just were like kindred spirits. So, Claudia, welcome to the Empowered Half Hour.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So, if you don't mind, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself.
Absolutely. So, my name is Claudia Garbutt, and I'm a molecular biologist by profession. But once I became a mom, I decided to do something else, and I became a mindset and high performance coach for entrepreneurs. And what I do is I use my science based coaching techniques to help those driven high achievers build their empires without sacrificing their health, relationships, or happiness along the way. And I'm also the host of the Wired for Success podcast, where we talk about all those things science, self development, and entrepreneurship that help you get to that next level in your life or business.
And your podcast is in the top 10 of entrepreneurial podcasts, right?
It was when it launched. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore, but yeah, I'll get back
Hey,
there.
you were still there, so it counts.
Yep.
And it's a really excellent podcast, especially I just want to stop before we get into the interview and invite the listeners to listen to it also because we have that kindred spirit. So if they like the High Achievers Club, they're probably going to like Wired for Success. So feel free to pop over and check out her podcast. But Claudia, let's get into this interview.
Mhm.
So, my first question for you. So, you talked a little bit in your bio where you started, but can you share for the audience, like, what's your backstory? Why are you here doing what you're doing today?
Well, the truth is, it's been a wild ride. Okay. So I will be the first to acknowledge that entrepreneurship does not come naturally to me. I'm a very reluctant entrepreneur and I've never dreamed about starting my own business. So, how did I get here? Well,
Yeah.
I think there have been two key experiences in my life that really guided my path. And in the beginning, I would say that my life pretty much followed a straight line until I finished my degree in molecular biology. So I've always been the good girl, the high achiever who dutifully just fulfills everyone else's expectations.
Hmm. Sounds
Sound
familiar.
familiar? And I think the thing with us high achievers is that we're super, super hard on ourselves and we always push ourselves. And this is our great strengths, but it's also simultaneously our great weakness because we don't know when to stop and we don't know how to quit. And we remain in toxic situations for far too long. And that's basically exactly what happened to me too. So I was in a toxic work environment where I got bullied. And at the same time, I was in a toxic relationship. So I really felt stuck between a rock and a hard place. I didn't want to go to work. I didn't want to come home either. I felt like I
Wow.
had nowhere to go. And as I said, my default mode is just to power through. So that's what I tried to do, even though it got harder and harder to do. And I was basically just focusing on getting through the day. And then one day, my body decided that enough was enough and pulled the plug. And I was just 28 when I got
Wow.
suddenly diagnosed with leukemia. And my life literally changed from one day to the next. Because as soon as I got the diagnosis, I had to pack a bag and leave to go to the hospital, which I wouldn't be allowed to leave for the next 6 weeks. And in
Wow.
those 6 weeks, I had to undergo several rounds of chemotherapy. I lost my beautiful long hair. I almost died from an infection. And I only weighed about 48 kilograms once I was allowed to leave again. So the weird thing was, while my body was struggling so much and I experienced so much physical pain, I pretty early on felt that it had happened for a reason and that my body wasn't betraying me so much as it was protecting me from myself, if that makes sense.
Yes. Such a powerful story. And I'm sure you have some more to share, but I was tearing just because I relate to it so much of how we can push our bodies into disease as a
Yes.
high achiever. Because again, the traits of a high achiever: commitment, dedication, loyalty, resilience. And so that line gets tricky of when to pull the plug, because those are our like core values.
Exactly.
And I think it's really important what you're talking about, because as you know, listeners are going through the same thing. And for them, I think the call out that I'd like to do in honoring her story is that these things powering through can lead to cancer. It can lead, like for me, I didn't get cancer, but I did get autoimmune disease. And it's very common to see autoimmune disease and cancer in high achieving women. So I
Yeah.
just want to throw that out there. And now back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really felt that my body had warned me over and over again, and I just hadn't listened. And I stayed in those situations that I should not have
Mm,
stayed in. And then I realized I couldn't go on living in this constant fear and the constant pressure and just putting everyone else first. And I needed to make some really hard decisions and choose what was right for me at that moment. So that's what I did. And once I recovered, I applied for a different PhD project in New Zealand. I broke up with my boyfriend. I moved to the other side of the planet. And it was so, so scary. But it still felt like it was something that I needed to do. And even though I made those big, scary changes, I still wasn't ready for a radical shift from academia to entrepreneurship. So that secondly happened after I became a mom and I decided that working in the lab 24/7 just wasn't compatible with the lifestyle that I wanted for my
mhm.
growing family. And then slowly, like very slowly, I started to consider building my own business, which then gradually led to where I am today.
That's such a powerful story. There's so much in there that I want to talk about, but I'd like to ask, you got diagnosed with leukemia, you had to immediately treat it. You knew what you were doing was no longer compatible. Then you ended up becoming a mom and really having to shift into this
Mhm.
entrepreneurial spirit. And all of this is new. I think this is a story that is really relatable. And a lot of people don't move from their toxic job or their toxic relationship because of fear. So, what I
Yeah.
want to ask you next is, what did you personally have to overcome to really rise into that?
Oh, so much.
Let's
As I
talk about
yeah,
it.
as I said, entrepreneurship was really, really foreign to me because growing up, my parents had always told me to never start my own business because it was just far too risky. I would have to work all the time, and it would just be so much easier to keep your head down, get a job, and just get paid without having to worry about anything else. And I had really taken that advice at face value and never questioned it. So when I started to contemplate the idea of building my own business, I immediately hit all of those fears and limiting beliefs. I was afraid to fail. I was afraid to succeed. I was afraid to be judged. I was afraid to be rejected. I was afraid to make mistakes, to make a fool of myself. I was stressed. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know where or how to start. From analysis paralysis to perfectionism, procrastination, I experienced every single mindset block that you can probably think of because I was a hot mess.
I relate to so much of it because it is really scary.
It is so scary. So to get to the other side, I really had to learn to rewire my mind for success because it wasn't working. So little by little and step by step, that's what I did. So I changed my beliefs, I changed my habits, I changed how my nervous system responded to challenges,
I love
and I
that.
learned new skills like life coaching, neurolinguistic programming, cognitive behavioral therapy, hypnotherapy, tapping, biohacking, breathwork, all the things. And once I had figured out what worked for me, I tried my approach on a couple of friends. And for those friends, it worked as well. And seeing their transformation was just so inspiring. I knew that I wanted to do more of that.
Mhm.
So I realized I had always been kind of a natural coach. And now I also had this great toolkit to help others who were struggling as well.
That's incredible. And I just want to acknowledge that you can see in this story, in Claudia's story, that she had to overcome quite a lot. And I love just being around you and your vibe because it's so like in alignment with mine. But that's really cool that you geeked out that hard.
Oh, yes. I'm a geek.
And I just relate to it because I'm like, oh my gosh, and she's like, more certifications? Yes, please. That's great. But what I want to share with the listeners is that she 180'd her life and she rose into what at one point felt impossible for her. And so if you're listening to this and you're sitting there and you're like, I want to make these really hard changes, but I'm scared, know that the fear is going to be there. But on the other side of fear, you are capable of rewiring. I mean, that's why she named her podcast Wired for Success, right? Where it's really possible. And so I hope you can feel the arc in this story where she is now on the other side. And we'll talk some more about that, like where you are now. But you just like take this inspiration and know that you don't have to stay stuck. You can rewire. And Claudia is just a perfect example of how you can do that. So,
Thank you.
yes, I didn't know your story so intimately. So I'm excited. Like, I'm happy to be on the receiving end and interviewing you this time. So I want to ask you something else. Being where you are now, and now we've kind of recapped where you were, what's a big lesson or aha moment that's up for you right now?
So many. One is kind of related to what you already said. So don't be afraid of failure, be afraid of regrets. I think that's so
Can you
powerful.
repeat that? Because that's a mic drop moment right there.
It is. Don't be afraid of failure, be afraid of regrets. Because I think when you're feeling drawn to something, it's for a reason. You might have no idea how to achieve your goals, but if you don't at least try, you will regret it. I promise you, you will regret it at some point. And all you need is to figure out that very first step and then the next. And before you know it, you will have made the progress you never thought possible.
I love that. And I wouldn't mind if you wanted to expand on that a little bit because I think when, especially I deal with a lot of high achievers too. And what I find is that when they're thinking of what's next for them, they're used to achieving and accomplishing very big goals. And so, but they almost don't start their next project because they're seeing the outcome that they want 5 years from now. And I love that you just talked about like the baby steps. So, can you talk about the importance of that? And maybe you do want to create that 5 year dream or
Mhm.
5 year goal, but the significance in the baby steps. I actually was just writing something about this. So, I wanted to geek out for a second
Hmm?
if you'd like to take that.
Absolutely. I think one thing that's very related to the regret thing is to understand that nobody has everything figured out. We are all just making it up as we go. And sometimes we can feel like everyone else got this invisible manual to this thing called life, and we somehow missed out on those key instructions. But that's just an illusion. We are all winging it. And it's really the path will appear once you start the journey. And
I
that's
love that so much because it's so true.
it is
Thank
right.
you. So, we've kind of talked about it, but I'd love to like dive into why are you so passionate about your work?
Yes. So maybe I should start with another key realization I had along the way, which is that health is not just about exercise and nutrition as I used to believe. Because don't get me wrong, those are definitely important, but mental and emotional health is so super important too. And nobody teaches this at school. If we want to stay healthy and happy in the long run, we just really have to figure out ways to manage ourselves, our emotions, and our relationships with others too. It all matters, and you cannot separate the mind from the body because it's a constant two-way communication with
Yeah.
lots of feedback loops. And holistic health is so important to me because I've experienced what happens when things go wrong. So many people get sick because they're stuck in these toxic relationships and they don't know how to escape. And this really breaks my heart. And I want to do my part to avoid this from happening. So I'm not saying that every illness can be prevented, but I think that you can definitely prevent a percentage of illnesses by being more mindful and by aligning your mind, body, and soul. So I'm all for being a bit ambitious and going after those big dreams, but I also want people to know that it's up to them to decide which goals to chase, and you're allowed to follow your heart, and you don't have to chase somebody else's dream.
Yes, that is, there's so much in that that I just want to talk about. But I mean, just where you ended, you don't have to chase someone else's dream. I think that you talked a little bit earlier about not having the manual to life. And we're kind of told pick a career. And maybe if people take a career that would make their parents proud, or they just pick something that their friends were doing out of college. I can't believe I'm just laughing at myself for a minute because my makeup is like all over the place. It's really hilarious. Anyway, but there's this, I think, even I just want to digress back for a second too when we're talking about careers and following someone else's dream. It's okay, even if you started to chase your dream and your dream changes, to give yourself permission to allow that to change. Because to your point, as I got really geeked out in studying burnout, what I learned is that when you get through, so I always say like burnout starts in the uns, you're going to feel unseen, unwanted,
Mm-hmm.
unheard. Then you start to feel the unders, which is undervalued, underappreciated, underrecognized. And then when all those things are triggered, it's in our human psyche to start, I call it overing, but overworking, overcompensating,
Mm-hmm.
overanalyzing, overthinking, overwhelming, overstressing, like all the overs. But that's like, if you recognize that you're overing, it's a good time to reevaluate what's working and what's not working. Because, like you were saying, once you get into past that, you're going to start questioning your belonging in a relationship. You're going to start questioning your belonging within an organization. And if you stay, then you're going to, I call it like disharmony in the bodies, but that's when your body starts getting like the ailments. They may not be like up and prevalent yet, but you're going to start feeling tension in your jaw and your shoulders. We ignore it, especially as high achievers, like, oh, I might have tweaked it at the gym, quite knowing that it wasn't the gym that's causing your body's
Mm-hmm.
pain. But it's
Yep.
because we ignore the mental and emotional feelings. We're overriding our systems. And that's just like, I wanted to geek out and talk about that a little bit, because that permission piece where you say you don't have to chase someone else's dreams, or it's okay to change your dreams, is because when you stay in a position that you shouldn't be in for too long, your emotional health and well being is the thing that gets compromised the most. And then, like you said, it leads to other things. But I don't know if you want to share. I don't necessarily have a question, but I shared a lot. What would you say have to share with the audience based upon my share?
Yeah, so I think you and I, we have a very similar story. We've both seen what happens when the tension builds up and we ignore it. And then the body just takes control and leads you down a path of, I'm saying stop right here. You can do whatever you want, but here's the stop sign. So my hope is that my story really empowers other high achievers out there to take better care of themselves. I hope that they find a way to challenge their beliefs around self worth and what it means to be successful. And I hope that they find a way to really deal with stress in a productive way, and that they learn to create boundaries that allow them to stay true to themselves.
Wow. I have the goosebumps like from head to toe. That was so powerful, because that's my hope too. There was no manual given. And ambitious people do ambitious things, but there was never a guide to how to do it in a way where your well being is prioritized.
No, and there's cycles. Like you and I talked about this before we started recording. Sometimes you have the phase, like in the startup phase of your business, you might focus more on just the business growth side. And that's okay. But you have to be very mindful that at some point you have to slow down again and focus more on the health side, because otherwise you will just end up burned out after a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to the next question. So, what's new and what's next for Claudia?
Yeah, that's another thing we already talked about just a little bit.
Uh-huh.
What I'm creating right now is called the Health Tech Collective, and it's a
Love it.
small group of ambitious and mission driven entrepreneurs who are starting a new venture in the health tech space. And I kind of created this accelerator program where we really focus on community, on building your brand, on building your product. And you don't have to do it alone because there are no brownie points for doing it the hard way. So you can just join a supportive community where we work on launching your next big thing.
I love it. I always like to ask like the why behind what people are doing. And we talked a little bit about this when we were just catching up, but why have you moved in that direction? What are you seeing with your clients?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So the initial vision was to just combine the best of a mastermind group and the one-on-one coaching, because I felt that the one-on-one coaching alone was kind of missing the synergy that you can create in a group setting. But the group was missing the tailored support that you get only through the one-on-one coaching elements. So I wanted to bring both of these elements together to create the best of both worlds.
I love it.
And then I started to work with a group of people. And as we did, things shifted because the things that I thought were super important to them actually weren't the things that were super important to them. And
It's
they,
like that sometimes as we're
it
building our
is,
businesses. Yes.
right? So what do? We take on the feedback and then we pivot and tweak. So it has turned more into this accelerated program right now, but it might change again over time depending on the group of people. So at the moment, I'm still exploring and I'm just running with it.
I
It's a
love
lot of
it though.
fun.
I love it. And you bring up just a really valid point. Like, you need support when you're starting a new business, first of all. And to be able to provide some guided framework is just, I think, so appreciated for me that because I know your intention, we were talking about this behind the scenes too, but your intention. When you become an entrepreneur, there is no shortage of programs that are available to help you build your business. But a lot of them don't do it from the perspective of making sure your well-being is prioritized first. And that's what I really like about what you're doing because that's where your heart center is.
So true. Yes, absolutely. And I always want to make sure that everyone in the group is comfortable because I've talked to quite a few people who end up in like 50 plus people mastermind groups where they get their 5 minutes in the spotlight and it doesn't really move the needle for them. So I really want to make sure that everyone is seen, everyone is heard, and that
I
we
love
can
it.
all support each other as on the journey because it's a wild roller coaster.
It is a wild ride. So I want to go back a little bit in the conversation if that's okay,
Sure.
because I'm sure the listeners are feeling empowered about at this point, like, hey, I have had very similar feelings to Claudia. I can turn this around. But what if they're in that pivotal point where they're still in a toxic work environment or a toxic relationship? That burning desire for change is there, and the rewiring is on the other side, but they haven't experienced it yet. What would you say to that person?
So I think the first thing is, well, if you're already aware, so awareness is always the first step, but then the decision part is the next huge piece. You have to decide that enough is enough and that something has to change. If you're not at the point where you really want change and you make that decision, as long as you haven't made the decision, you will stay stuck. So awareness, decision, and then first step. Don't overthink it, get help, and start small. You can always start small, or you can just reach out to somebody and get help.
Yeah, I love that because I would probably give similar advice too. I have the goosebumps head to toe, by the way. I loved everything about that. And then on the other side of the change, what would be a rewiring tip or two that you would like to share with the audience?
So, what I personally have found super, super helpful is hypnotherapy or just listening to guided meditations and not only doing it once in a while when you're feeling down. It's something that you have to do over and over again because that's the way your brain learns. So, it's one thing is experiences and fully immersing yourself in an experience. And the other thing is to really repeat, repeat, repeat. So repetition is key here. So if you want to rewire a belief, you have to replace it with a new one. And you
Mhm.
have to repeat that belief over and over again until it feels just as natural as the limiting belief used to feel. Because that's the thing, right? Our limiting beliefs feel like the truth. They feel like a true statement to us. And we have to change that. We have
I
to be like,
just like, yes, 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 and yes, because shifting that belief, I mean, beliefs dictate our subconscious decisions.
yes.
And so I love that answer because it's for listeners, guys, this is really practical advice. I mean, it sounds kind of like, oh, I have to put work in, but yeah, you have to put work in to do the change. So there's no story here where the work doesn't need to happen.
Nope.
But the good news is it's all doable. And once that happens, where you shift from the limiting belief to the empowering belief, that belief is going to be the one making your subconscious decisions. And suddenly the sky's not falling as much, right? Like your decisions start to support you. And anyway, Claudia, like I just love your answer. That was amazing. And I think it's going to be really empowering to the audience.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So we are winding down. 30 minutes flies by so fast. But I would love for you to share with the audience how they can stay in touch with you and find more about you. Like if they want to approach you for any coaching or anything like that, feel free to share more
Sure.
about you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. So, as we mentioned in the intro, if you enjoy podcasts, I would love for you to check out my Wired for Success podcast. I have some really, really amazing guests. You can listen to my interview with Becca. We talk about, as I said, all things science, self-development, and entrepreneurship. And the show's available on pretty much like all the major platforms. But for anyone who really enjoys things like maybe guided meditations or exercises with a side of biohacking or additional quick tips and insights, I would love to invite you to join my newly created podcast subscription on Spotify, where I share some exclusive subscriber only content. And for everyone who, or for anyone who is interested in coaching, you can always find me on LinkedIn, which is my favorite platform right now, and just connect and send me a message.
Aw, that's awesome. Well, Claudia, I can't believe the interview is up. 30 minutes went by so fast.
I know.
Thank you for coming on the Empowered Half Hour and sharing your story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's always so much fun to talk with
I
you.
know, it always is. Thanks again.